Sometimes we hear a story so often that we get used to the meaning that people want to attach to it, even when we can look at that story and tell that that meaning really doesn't fit. The story of Snow White is often used as an example of the aphorism, "Beauty is only skin deep." This idea that it doesn't matter how beautiful you are on the outside, you can be the most beautiful person in the world, but what you are on the inside is really what counts. Of course, the problem there is the whole premise around Snow White is that the most beautiful person in the world, Snow White, is in fact also very lovely on the inside. And this story seems to be more about not letting envy rule you for fear that you might go to ruin. We have a similar thing that happens when we read the story of Hansel and Gretel. This story, if you read some of the early texts of this story, where they actually write the moral in there for you, says, "Never trust a stranger." Okay, I mean, yeah, they do meet the witch and they do trust her, and that's what gets her in trouble. But I would think that the larger message behind Hansel and Gretel, is maybe don't abandon your children in the forest. There seem to be a lot of bad choices that led up to the point where Hansel and Gretel are lost and alone in the forest with no one to turn to and find the cottage where the witch is. Sure, maybe they shouldn't have trusted that stranger, but did they have much of an alternative when they had no idea where else to go? I'm not so sure that moral fits all that well either. And when it comes to the Bible, this impulse is increased because it feels like the stakes are higher. Every Bible story that we read carries this feeling of having some grand meaning that's carried out on a cosmic level, especially when that story is literally about the creation of the cosmos.
Now no shrub of the field had yet grown on the earth, and no plant of the field had yet sprouted, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the earth, and there was no man to cultivate the ground. Springs would well up from the earth and water the whole surface of the ground. The Lord God formed the man from the soil of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. The Lord God took the man and placed him in the orchard in Eden to care for it and to maintain it. Then the Lord God commanded the man, "You may freely eat the fruit of every tree of the orchard, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat from it, you will surely die."
We know this story. We know what's coming, and we know what it means. Or at least we think we do. After God gives the man this commandment, the man looks for a suitable mate, naming all of the animals in the process and finding none. So God makes him one by dividing him in half and making a woman out of one half and keeping the man from the other half. And the two are in love, and they walk around their garden paradise with God, content and enjoying life until one fateful day.
Now the serpent was more shrewd than any of the wild animals that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Is it really true that God said you must not eat from any tree of the orchard?" The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit from the trees of the orchard, but concerning the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the orchard, God said, you must not eat from it. You must not touch it, or else you will die." The serpent said to the woman, "Surely you will not die. For God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will open, and you will be like divine beings who know good and evil." When the woman saw that the tree produced fruit that was good for food, was attractive to the eye, and was desirable for making one wise, she took some of its fruit and ate it. She also gave some of it to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them opened, and they knew they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. Then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God moving about in the orchard at the breezy time of the day, and they hid from the Lord God among the trees of the orchard.
Now, whether we read this as the literal first sin that really happened by the literal first people, or as symbolically representative of human nature, it's generally agreed by most people who read this passage that this story is meant to tell us about how people are inherently flawed and sinful. So we call this story the Fall. And we're pretty sure it explains all sorts of grand things in our world. It explains why there's evil in the world, why life is hard for us, why we are, or at least feel, distant from God. And most importantly in the Christian tradition, why God had to take on human form in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. I'm not convinced that that's the case, though. Actually, I think this story tells us something a lot more basic about our nature as humans. As humans, we grow up. We become like those who have raised us and poured themselves into us as we grow up. And as we grow, we find freedom and we make choices. Sometimes those choices are good, and sometimes those choices are bad, but increasingly as we age, those choices are our own. And because of how we've grown up, we begin to assign value to our choices. We have been taught to believe a certain way, to live a certain way, to act a certain way, and to think a certain way. So when we make a choice for ourselves, we filter that through everything we've been taught and decide this is a good choice, this is a bad choice. This is a thing that I probably shouldn't have done, but I'm glad to have gotten away with. This is a thing I'm supposed to do, but I hate to do. This is a thing I'm supposed to do, but I actually really love doing, so I'm okay with that. Thank you, Mom and Dad. We assign these values because of the way we have been raised, and we live with them. And we live with the feelings that our choices create, the consequences that our choices create. So if we believe that something was a bad thing and we weren't supposed to do it, usually the first feeling that we encounter is guilt. Now that's not to say that the second or third or fourth or 28th time we make that choice, we will feel as guilty. But largely the first time you do something that you feel like is not supposed to be done and it's taboo, your first feeling is guilt. Shame. This sense that there is something wrong with you that you need to cover up and hide and keep from the world. And sometimes those choices really should be causing those feelings. And sometimes they're more of an indication that you have advanced and developed. When children are very small, at least in my house, they are told to leave glasses alone. If there is a full glass of some kind of liquid sitting on the table, and my almost 2-year-old reaches for that glass, I'm going to say, no, don't touch that, leave that alone, because she is going to spill that glass all over herself. But I hope at some point in her development, just like what happened with her older brother, she will reach a point where she is thirsty, and I say, go get yourself a glass from the cupboard. Go fill it with water. Do what you want to do. There will be a developmental change where this thing that is taboo for her right now, is a bad idea for her right now, is a perfectly normal part of her life. And that's an innocuous example, but there are many other areas of life where this same principle applies. So the man and the woman go and they eat this fruit. They have been taught to believe that eating the fruit from the tree was a bad thing. And it probably was a bad thing for them at that time in their life. God probably knew what God was saying when God said to the man, hey, don't eat that fruit over there. That's bad for you. It's the knowledge of good and evil. Imagine being underdeveloped, being but an infant in the eyes of God, and being weighed down with having to know that there are good and evil in the world, and being able to tell the difference between the two. We wouldn't want a small child to be aware of these things. We talk about preserving innocence for children because of this exact reason. We don't want them to know about the evil in the world. And yet, at the same time, we know that they are going to grow up, and they're going to reach a point where they begin to understand good and evil. They're going to understand right and wrong, and then they're going to grow a little older, and they're going to start to realize that a lot of things in this world are not completely good, are not completely evil. There's a lot of space in between those two concepts where they're going to have to work through, is this right for me? Is this wrong for me? Is this right for me, but maybe not right now at this time? They will grow up and they will mature and they will begin to develop an understanding, but certainly you wouldn't want that knowledge to come all at once. You don't want to walk up to a 5-year-old and lay out the reality of the world and say, this is how it is, absorb this. In fact, they will probably stare at you and not absorb it, because their minds have been built not to be ready for these things yet. So the man and the woman were not ready. They went and they tasted this fruit. And the freedom that they had felt at having the liberty to make their own choices gave way to this feeling of guilt, of making a wrong choice. They had a broader knowledge of reality now. And suddenly they realized why eating this fruit was maybe not such a good thing. Because when you are burdened with knowing about the evils that exist in this world that you were blissfully unaware of just moments ago, that's never a good feeling. Now, yes, consequences would come, as they always do when a loving parent discovers a child's indiscretion. But it's not because this is a fall from grace. It's not because the relationship between humans and God has been somehow permanently or irreparably damaged. These consequences come precisely because of that relationship, because God continues to love these two imperfect, flawed humans, and sees that they have developed now in such a way that it's time for their relationship to move on to the next stage. And as we all know, at some point your relationship with your children reaches that stage where it's time for them to move out and make it on their own. That they can no longer be coddled by their parents' success, that they can no longer live at home and rely completely on mom and dad, or just dad, or in this case God, to provide for them. That it's time to strike out on their own because they have knowledge of the world, and so God sends them out. It says, look, life is going to be really hard for you. You're going to have to make it on your own. You're going to have to grow your own garden now. You can't rely on my garden anymore. And the two of you are together, and eventually children are going to come, and I promise you that raising and bearing children is going to be a very difficult thing for you to experience. You may love it, it may be incredibly rewarding, but that experience is going to come with pain. He gives them these warnings that seem perfectly natural to us, that we don't think of as being necessarily the result of sin, except when we read this story and are convinced that we're reading the story of a terrible fall from grace. Why? We don't need to think that way. The man and the woman are simply growing up, and it is time for them to make their own way in this world. Now, usually when we tell this story after we've bemoaned the fall of humanity and given thanks that Jesus has come and repaired the rift between humans and God, we're left without much of a moral left to provide. we're left saying, okay, so don't sin. Yeah, don't sin. That's what you can do. As if such an admonition could actually be heeded and followed 100%. But I wonder how things would change if instead of seeing ourselves as the man and the woman in this passage, we were to maybe put ourselves in God's shoes. If maybe the lesson here is not, oh, don't sin, that feels way too obvious, but if perhaps what we're supposed to be learning here is how to respond as others grow and develop, and yes, fracture relationships at times, and yes, do things that they're not supposed to at times. How we might respond to them the way that God responded to the man and the woman. By informing them, quite simply, here are the consequences of your choices. Here is what is going to come because of the path that you have started down. You're going to have to do this, but I continue to love you. I continue to support you. I continue to be here. There is no gap in the story of the man and the woman who eventually come to be known as Adam and Eve, where God is absent from the picture. God is there with Adam and Eve throughout their lives. God is down talking to Cain and Abel during their lives and to the descendants of Adam and Eve for generation after generation, because God cares about these people. Because even though it was time for Adam and Eve to move out and start things on their own, like a loving parent, God was checking in. Hey, how are things going? Is that whole tilling the ground thing, I know it's tough, but how's it coming along? Oh, I see you have children now. Was that a tough experience? How are you raising them? What are you doing? How is that going? God didn't abandon Adam and Eve. There was no point of separation. And we can learn a lot from the kind of love that God showed to these two people when it was time for them to move forward in their lives. Now, there are many children downstairs, and there's some youth floating around here, and I know this is a fairly easy point of contact to make for people who are parents of those children and youth, to say, oh yeah, well, my kids are growing up, so that's what this story is about. But it's not limited to parenting. We see these things happen in our lives in many ways, in the people that we encounter, because development never ends. The chance to gain knowledge of good and evil never ends. All of these things that the man and the woman are experiencing when they take a single bite of a single piece of fruit take a lifetime for us to learn. And so we have the honor and the privilege of being able to be present when someone else has taken a bite of that fruit. When they have developed in some way that they had not previously, when they have gained a form of knowledge that they did not previously possess, we can be present and we can represent God in their lives, making ourselves available, letting them know straight up what is going to happen, but also remaining present in the journey. And through that presence with them, each of these individuals, each person in your life, gets to receive a degree of assurance that no matter what happens, no matter what knowledge is gained, no matter what development takes place, there are those who will be present with them, guiding them, helping them on their journey. So don't worry about being Adam or Eve in this story. It's time for each and every one of us to step up and ask what God would do.